On today's edition of Expert Speak, we are extremely honored and delighted to have a very respected and distinguished member of the Indian strategic community, Ambassador Anil Wadhwa. He served as Secretary East, as our ambassador to Italy. He headed India's role with the East European countries, amongst many other assignments. Ambassador Wadhwa, may I just welcome you and say that how delighted we are to have you on this version of Expert Speak.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to speak to you today. And Asian Confluence is doing a very good job, and wish you great success in the future.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
You asked me about regional cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region in the economic recovery which is needed post-pandemic. Then you also asked me about how do you see US-China relations evolving during the COVID, and also against this backdrop, what is the evolving nature of the bilateral relations between countries of the Quad. And then you also asked about the importance of COVID-19 as an issue in critical political and strategic negotiations such as security and trade standards. Right.
Sir.
So I think I would, if I may, I would first start with a few opening remarks to the three questions combined. First of all, it depends a lot on, this is a globalized and interconnected world, as we all know, and it depends a lot on how seasonal or yearly or what is the duration of this pandemic. So the impact would vary according to that. And there would be an impact on collective security through a number of factors. First of all, resources. Second is trade and investments. Third is the military preparedness of countries, and fourth is regional stability. And in that, I would also include regime stability, depending on the factors how important they are. So today, the international system is pushed by global connectivity, and it's enhanced by what we know as increased physical mobility. So basically, everything works on supply and demand, those not being impeded. Now, COVID-19 has actually thrown sand into all these gears. So you look at medical supplies of pharmaceuticals, or you look at industries like automobiles. And then oil is a very important factor. The world runs on oil. That's in tremendous strain. There is also a strain on tight alliances. And look at Europe, for instance, where there is no agreement amongst the 27 countries how to help Italy, for instance. There is military preparedness, which has been affected in the United States, for instance. No exercises are taking place anywhere in the world. And the regime stability, countries like North Korea and Iran, it's a major factor about how this pandemic will affect them. And finally, in terms of global connectivity, because all those countries which were closely connected in this crisis, economically with China, for example, in tourism and trade and investments, the impact of COVID-19 has been very high. I'll give you examples of Italy, Iran, and South Korea, all of them connected with China. So now, of course, there is an action by countries of closing their borders. And obviously, this will bring about great changes in what we know as regional connectivity as well. So, what my first premise over here is that in terms of the response which will happen as far as economic recovery is concerned, we will first look at the global value chains, whether they will come under doubt in future. And will businesses move to more open and more safer, countries, so that they can create a global value chain there? In their perception, whatever is safe, open regimes, for instance. We have seen that happen with Japan, for example, setting aside a $2 billion fund to move their companies out of China, and also setting aside a fund to help their companies to relocate to other geographies. So over time, you will have a movement in the services sector also. Large part of it will move into the digital space, creating what we call virtual workspaces. And this will therefore be a comparison between digital and physical connectivity. The region of Southeast Asia is very heavily connected both ways in terms of physical connectivity. If you look at the ongoing projects and cooperation, China's BRI is one great example of connectivity, physical connectivity in the region. And of course, the presence of Japan and lately the pushback that we saw from a combined pushback from Japan, Australia, and United States combined. United States under its Build Act, the Area Act, and Japan under its ODA is emphasis on quality infrastructure. Australia with its emphasis on extra funds for funding the Pacific, Southern Pacific countries. And at the same time, you have also India, which is helping the Southern Pacific with $2 million annually as a grant. So, there was a sort of coalition developing in any case in the region as a counter to China's BRI. But this is as far as physical connectivity is concerned. How this will play out in the future will depend on the duration and the intensity of the COVID pandemic. Second issue that I wanted to touch upon was also in terms of traditional manufacturing, which has happened so far in countries in Southeast Asia and in the Indo-Pacific. Perhaps China may not be such a trusted partner any longer in the eyes of a few. There would therefore be an added importance of informal groupings which have arisen already, like the Quad in that context. So from here, I would like to go on to your question about what is the evolving nature of the relationship between countries of the Quad, and how do you see the US-China relationship evolving in the future? So I think if we look at the response of the United States, that's already going in a certain direction. So now United States will hope that it can actually strengthen its alliance system to so obviously this will expand China, and the economic coercion part of it is in favor of China because they are in proximity to the countries of the Indo-Pacific. So how this will play out, that remains to be seen. Now, as opposed to the bipolar world order, which is China and the United States, what we are seeing today like US, but also Russia, Japan, and India, who become important as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned. Seen this as a rise in terms of a risk of miscalculation, etc. If you look at United States, that sees China as a revisionist great power that, in their eyes, is working to regulate access to the Indo-Pacific to serve its own values and its own interests, and therefore they say that it is to undermine the rules-based order and create an exclusive economic sphere which is dependent on the Chinese economy, and therefore construct a China-centric system. So obviously the push from the United States would be to resist that because they say that this threatens openness, also interconnectedness, freedom of trade, which is the basis of an open international order. So the United States therefore decided to act to maintain a free and unconditional access to and amongst the Indo-Pacific economies. And it also means that it will try to maintain open markets and free trade principles. And also this will require a continuing ability on the part of the United States to freely transit the Indo-Pacific sea lanes for trade, and that goes for its alliance partners as well, not only for the US but also for everyone else, because they see that as a public good. The next point that I wanted to make here, and I've touched upon that already, is that the new thrust for an alternative to BRI was already emerging in the region. So as far as if all goes well, and in terms of the pandemic not playing out for too long, then the Indo-Pacific will require a massive infusion of capital. It has to depend, of course, on the international lending institutions largely, but also, as opposed to BRI, there's an alternative which has emerged. And as I said earlier, it's a combination of funds which are available through the United States, and it's Blue Dot, United States and Japan in one initiative under which they undertake joint projects in countries of the Indo-Pacific. Mainly is concentrated on the Pacific Island states because of the Chinese push into the South Pacific, because that's the new frontier. But at the same time, the same could be utilized also for existing projects which are ongoing, where Japan is playing a major role. And India is also undertaking a number of connectivity projects. As we know, two of them we know of, which are very prominent, not doing so well in terms of execution. But at the same time, if there is a joining of hands, perhaps there would be much more availability of finances, which would match the Chinese BRI. So I think on the whole, it could be a good development for the region. And as I said, in terms of physical proximity, that dependence will definitely reduce. And therefore, there would be more emphasis on providing services in a digital format rather than in a physical format. So the mode of operation might change over there. Second issue, which I wanted to talk about in the same context, was on regional security and the China factor. So here, we have seen why the Quad has come to the fore, why the Quad has arisen. Let's analyze that. It's obviously started with Chinese cartographic aggression in the region, and there was aggression on the land border as far as India is concerned. Doklam happened. There was also aggression in the seas. We saw that in Senkaku Islands with Japan, in the South China Sea with Vietnam and the Philippines, in the Natuna Islands with Indonesia. So there is a perception that China is building a blue water navy to defend its own sea lanes of communication, and also to become a dominant force in the Indian as well as the Pacific Oceans. Port buildings activities have taken place at the same time, and the main examples are Gwadar and Djibouti, for instance. And then we must not forget that similar activities are happening in Myanmar and in Bangladesh, which are also countries which are of concern to the countries of the region. There is also the integration which Chinese require. Now, if you look at BRI, for instance, why all this is happening, it's because the Chinese require an integration of their own markets. So it's a blueprint. BRI is a blueprint for integrating their markets, but also to gain access to resources, to utilize the excess domestic capacity which they had at one point in time. And I think post-COVID, this would be an enhanced factor. Also strengthening the Chinese periphery, gaining strategic military access in the maritime domain beyond the Eurasian heartland, and also to enlist what they call all-weather friends. So Pakistan, for instance, would be one such example. There is also the strategic and security underpinnings of the US and the China relationship, which will get exacerbated in the post-COVID world. It is no longer, as we know, a trade spat. It's no longer about theft of intellectual property, but a reaction in the United States and in Europe, I believe now, to the rise of China, which the USA would seek to counter. And new US tariffs, which have actually targeted the high-tech industries in China are all those where China hopes to lead between 2025 and 2049. Then there is the ASEAN-centric security institutions. If you look at those closely, they have failed to check the issue of China's rise. Why? Because there's been economic interdependence, there has been soft loans and funds which have been advanced by China, and that has induced the ASEAN to fall in line, or at least not have a common voice on the issue. And that's wherefore we saw that right from 2012 onwards, there is no common voice as far as ASEAN is concerned, on the issue of the South China Sea. That brings me then to the third point, and here I wanted to talk. Before I go to the third point, yet another issue, which is about the Quad itself. Now, Quad, as you know, has been meeting in an informal setting at the level of. Last time it met at the level of ministers for the first time in New York on the sidelines of the UNGA. But before that, at junior officers level, which is the middling level of level, the direction of the Quad has been evolving, but very, very slowly. In a sense, it's not something which has evolved as a security alliance, but as something where like-minded democracies coordinate their actions and reactions, although they don't see it, but at the same time, it is a reaction to what is happening in terms of the policies adopted by China. But nobody wants to spell that out, so that's the dilemma the Quad faces. And now we've had, in the COVID world, we've had an evolution. We've had a Quad Plus meeting. So on the 20th of March, for the first time, Vietnam, South Korea, New Zealand joined the 4 Quad countries. And here they decided that they met again on the 27th of March. Then they decided they'll meet every week. So here it's not just coronavirus remedies that they're discussing, but they're also discussing how to revive their economies once the threat subsides. And that's very important. And therefore it gets linked to your first question about what will happen in the recovery phase in the Indo-Pacific. So who will play a role? I think it is these economies which will start playing a role much more than the ASEAN. Now, if you look at ASEAN itself, it's not as if they've not done anything. They've also coordinated and they've talked about the coronavirus crisis. And slowly, I'm sure they'll come up with a fund which will be available to the countries of ASEAN to utilize to the best of their ability. But obviously, funding will be required in the future for an economic recovery. The members of the Quad, the original members of the 4 Quad countries, all have a bilateral relationship with ASEAN, under which they have a number of projects, and they've already set aside funds for bilateral cooperation. I believe that the Quad should forget bilateral cooperation and should come together and pool their resources and try and help in whichever way and in the competence which they have, and also work with ASEAN in this regard. So that would be, in my view, the best way to move forward in the future, if they can agree on this. I believe they can agree on the, as I already said, in the infrastructure side, but on the pandemic side and on bilateral projects which they've been doing on their own, there would be some differences because many countries would like to concentrate on projects which are more important for them. So whether there are differences, I suppose they can set those aside, but whatever they can agree on to do jointly, they should pool their resources and do that. That will be a much faster way of recovery, economic recovery in the Indo-Pacific. I believe the Quad Plus should keep meeting in the future while the coronavirus pandemic is on. In future, both the Quad Plus and the Quad can exist together. Quad will be the core. Quad Plus would be an extension of that. And as far as security issues are concerned, I'm afraid that will continue to be discussed in the Quad countries much more than in the Quad Plus. Right. But that depends on how the situation evolves in the future. Then we come to the ASEAN-centric security institutions again. I told you already that they've not been able to actually take a common stand as far as their own security is concerned, all because of the pressures that have been brought to bear on them by China or economic inducements. But I believe after COVID, they would look at the situation anew. And, for them also, it's not just important to balance out powers like China and the United States, but also to make sure that their own security and sea lanes of communication are secure, which had seemed to be eroding in the recent past. There are negotiations on with China on a common code of conduct, which have not gone too well in terms of the outcome that the ASEAN wanted to have, but they're hanging in there in the hope that and I think the ASEAN will be able to fairly balance particular very critical issue. Now, the last point that I wanted to make before I end is the security and trade standards you talked about. And will COVID-19 be an issue in the political and strategic negotiations? I think it would depend a lot on how, again, it plays out and how much impact it has. Certainly, as far as security is concerned, it does not affect directly, but at the same time, it would play a role in trade standards, in my view. And you rightly picked that point, because when we talk about how we conduct trade, how RCEP will be implemented, for instance. Now we know that RCEP does not have important clauses which India wanted, for instance, rules of origin. And that's very loose, and there's no implementation procedure. Secondly, it did not have any redressal mechanism which countries could go to and evoke in terms of a surge in imports from a particular country above a certain level. So from that perspective, RCEP would be dominated by stronger countries like China, for instance, and the others would be trying to struggle to keep pace with that situation. Already, therefore, we see that there is a rethink in Japan because their industry is moving out from China into other countries, or they would try to do that. It takes some time to do that. But there's been a rethink on that. And how much integration should there be? 30,000 companies which work in China today is a large number. And Japan obviously would not like to be so integrated and so dependent. And therefore, when you talk about trade, Japan would like to have much higher trade standards and build in more safeguards and clauses into agreements like RCEP, for instance, so that events like COVID, which affect everyone, do not have an impact in the future. So everyone would be looking at what arises as a result of this pandemic and how to avoid that in future, both in terms of security, in terms of trade, in terms of investments. And essentially, it would be how much trust you can place in your partner or partners, and what safeguards you can build into any kind of trade negotiations or investments that you're making or receiving from outside. So this is the sum total.
Thank you so much, sir, Ambassador Wadhwa, for those very enlightening. You presented such a lucid picture of what's happening on over the whole globe, actually. I just cannot miss this opportunity to ask you a small follow-up question, um, uh, which is that closer to home, in this whole backdrop that you presented, Asian Confluence is working a lot with the neighborhood, and in India's position in the Quad and Quad Plus, and in general in this whole scenario, I think strengthening the neighborhood first policy, are how tight are we with the neighbors in with regional trade, cooperation, security matters a lot. And with respect to the particular role of developing the northeastern and eastern front of India towards that end. Your quick comments on that, sir.
So I think, you rightly pointed out about the role that India can play here. I think this opportunity that has come about is a unique opportunity for India, but it all depends on how India handles this crisis. If we are able to handle this crisis in a fairly balanced manner, then I think India would emerge as one of those countries which countries would see as an important and a safer place to invest in. That's my first surmise. Second is the fact that Northeast in particular will become very important in terms of resources, human capital, the environment, and sheer promise, because it's an uncharted territory still. Third issue is the proximity that the Northeast has with a number of our neighboring countries. And now, of course, it's a fact that that exploitation has not happened due to various factors, because Northeast, in recent history has been a closed region for the outside world. It's only the last decade or so that there's thinking which is going on to open that and how to connect the Northeast with the rest of the world through Myanmar, through Bangladesh, whichever country you can think of. And also the regional cooperation concept has come about after a great deal of struggle. Because while we have, for example, thought of the BIMSTEC, just to take that as an example, when we talk about a traffic agreement, a vehicular traffic agreement between the BIMSTEC countries, one would have thought at that point in time that would be the easiest thing to achieve. But you have, reservations on the part of Bhutan, for instance, because rightly so, because they don't want, an invasion of vehicular traffic into their country. So I believe that can be managed with certain modifications and restrictions. And if they are really interested, and I believe they're coming around to that concept now. Second issue is about cooperation in water. Third is about cooperation in electricity grids. And fourth is about small and medium enterprises of the region. If we can bring about a confluence, just to borrow a word from your organization, of interests in the small and medium enterprises and businessmen who are not big players, but at the same time want to develop cross-border relationships. And I think it cuts across the board in Nepal, in Bhutan, Myanmar, Bangladesh, and India. That would be the ideal situation. So the Northeast can play a crucial role in that respect. For this to happen, and I think the interstate barriers have to be removed, which we've been talking about for quite some time. And secondly, there should be also the last mile connectivity, which again we've been talking about for quite some time now in the past 4 or 5 years. Things are improving. It's not as if we are stagnant there. I think a lot of improvement has happened, has come about. Border roads, there's been a lot of improvement as well. Railways has seen a lot of improvement. And a certain amount of funds have been set aside also for that last mile road connectivity, which is also important. In all this, I think, what the Northeast has to look at is how can they benefit from this opening up, and what should be done for them to be benefited by that kind of opening up to the rest of the countries which are around them. So that's always been a constant issue. Now, of course, there are domestic issues which come in the way sometimes. One of them that we are facing right now, which we all know about. If we can get over that quickly, then we can move on with our cooperative programs in that respect. So, while the COVID-19 situation has actually dealt a bit of a blow to physical connectivity, as I told you already. So therefore, we will have a lot of hesitations in the near future in terms of tourism, in terms of cross-border movement of people. I believe this should not last so long and this will also give us time to think about, prepare how to be in that situation, how to exploit it in the future.
Sure. Thank you so much, sir, for that. I think what you just said is needs to percolate down to the policymakers in the Northeast, because there has to be more awareness built, and that's something that we would like to do as a part of these video series also.
Right.
So on that note, sir, thank you so much for joining in for this edition of Expert Speak. Yeah.
All right.
So thank you so much, sir, for your time.
Thank you.